Welcome to Master Food Preserver. We are excited to have you join us in this program. As you move through this and other modules, you will learn more about the importance of food safety and food preservation and how Extension plays an important role in offering research-based information on these topics. The goal is that these videos, along with the manual, that you will have the resources and knowledge to help others learn and understand safe food handling and preserving practices. In this section, we will cover the basics of canning, foodborne illness, basic principles in home canning, and emergency preparedness. There's quite a bit of information to review, so we will briefly discuss the main topics in each section. I encourage you to follow along with the manual throughout the presentation. We will start with the basics. In Chapter 1, we will cover food quality, food preservation methods, and packaging. The quality of preserved food varies greatly based on characteristics of the fresh food that is processed, as well as the preservation method. To have the highest quality preserved food, it is important for you to use foods that are pleasant to eat, free from any microbial spoilage and toxins such as mold, yeast, and other bacteria, as well as non-microbial spoilage. Non-microbial spoilage often refers to the natural process of decomposition of foods as opposed to microorganisms that cause spoilage. Enzymatic action is one way of non-microbial spoilage. This happens when cells in a fruit are ruptured, or the nutrient reduction in a green bean that was picked 24 to 48 hours ago. Bruising or crushing of raw foods is another way that increases the enzymatic activity. Oxygen has its effects on food as well. The exposure to oxygen will cause oxidation, which can lead to foods becoming rancid and having off flavors or off colors. Moisture loss often softens food and causes food to lose flavor and moisture. Insect contamination is sometimes unavoidable in fresh or harvested grains and vegetables. Food spoilage is most often caused by microbial spoilage and the growth of mold, yeast, or bacteria. Some of these are naturally occurring. The most challenging part to all of this is that bacteria and microorganism growth cannot be seen, tasted, or smelled. Microorganisms are only visible when they are in the masses containing millions of cells. Mold requires water and air to grow. There are anywhere between 10,000 and 300,000 or more types of mold. Some we like in our food, such as mold in blue cheese, and others can be toxic and cause illness. Yeast can grow in a high or low acid environment. Masses of yeast often appear as slime, scum, or murkiness. Yeast fermentation, which we will discuss in Chapter 6, is recognized by gas bubbles, froth, or foam, which is the result of production of carbon dioxide. This process can result in desirable or spoiled food. Bacteria in foods can be pathogenic or non-pathogenic. Bacteria that causes illnesses is commonly referred to as pathogenic or pathogens. There are a number of bacteria that are non-pathogenic, meaning not causing illness, and sometimes we desire them in the foods we eat, such as the fermentation process to produce cheeses, pickles, and sauerkraut. FAT-TOM is the acronym we use to help us remember the environmental conditions that influence bacteria growth. Food, the nutrients in the food determine what bacteria can grow. Acidity, each food has its own pH or acidity. We will talk more about this in the next slide. Time and temperature. These are the two factors that we have control over. We are able to heat or cool foods to specific temperatures to limit or stop the growth of bacteria. Bacteria can increase quickly. Only a few bacteria can double every 10 minutes in optimal conditions. The chart to the right shows the effect of time on bacteria growth. Oxygen is important to remember that some pathogens grow well with oxygen and others grow well without oxygen. And moisture. Bacteria thrive on moist food. Various bacteria, yeasts, and molds have different moisture requirements. You can learn more about water activity and how it affects pathogen growth. You will read more detailed information about each of these factors in Fat Tom in Chapter 1. And in food preservation, we pay specific attention to acidity of the foods. Acidity, or pH, plays an important role in determining what methods we use to preserve food. The pH scale ranges from 0 to 14, with a value of 7 being neutral. The lower the number, the more acidic the food is, and consequently, the higher the number, the more alkaline or basic the food is. Foods with a pH of 4.6 or lower are considered acidic foods, which includes most fruits, most tomatoes, and pickles. Low acid foods have a pH above 4.6, which includes meats, poultries, fish, and vegetables. Pages 1-7 and 1-8 list the pH values of foods that we commonly can. Throughout this course, we will learn in depth about each of these methods of food preservation. People preserve food for a variety of different reasons. Ultimately, the goal is to optimize produce, save money, and have the opportunity to enjoy a variety of foods throughout the year. Each method has its pros and cons, so it's important for the food preserver to decide which method is best for the product and their situation. What will you decide to store your food in? There are many choices when it comes to packaging, such as reusing containers like glass jars, vacuum sealing, and plastics. This is an important question to ask when it comes to food preservation. Proper packaging offers protection from chemical or other physical contaminants that can cause foodborne illness. So we've talked some about pathogens in that first chapter. Chapter 2, we will dive deeper into foodborne illnesses and prevention. Foodborne illnesses can come from a variety of different sources. However, they are primarily biological. There are approximately 48 million cases of microbe-related foodborne illnesses each year, meaning you have a 1 in 6 chance of suffering from a foodborne illness. These illnesses are costly, and symptoms can vary based on the type of pathogen causing the illness. Generally, foodborne illnesses and their symptoms include nausea, abdominal cramps, vomiting, diarrhea, and muscle aches. When preparing foods for vulnerable populations, it is important to take extra precaution. High-risk populations of people include the very young, the very old, pregnant women, and those who are ill from other causes, such as a compromised immune system. Pathogens can be transferred in a variety of ways. Most bacteria pathogens prefer to live in the intestines of animals and humans. A common vehicle of transmission includes soil, water, animal products during processing, and infected food handlers who practice poor personal hygiene, such as not washing their hands. When food is contaminated with pathogens, the food will look, smell, and taste normal, but it can make someone extremely ill. Viruses are the cause of the majority of foodborne illnesses. Norovirus is the most common cause of acute gastroenteritis. This is considered a very infectious virus because it takes less than 10 viral particles to make one person sick. Hepatitis A is more rare and caused by the consumption of contaminated food and water. Parasites need a living host to provide food and shelter. Infections are caused by intestinal worms and protozoan parasites. We will read more about these parasites in Chapter 2. Many bacterial pathogens cause infection or intoxication. Toxins generally result in rapid illness, and infections tend to show up with symptoms within 24 to 48 hours. You will read more about each of these bacteria foodborne illnesses on pages 2-8 through 2-13. To practice safe food handling and reduce foodborne illnesses, there are 5 recommended food handling practices to follow. Avoid food and water from unsafe sources. This can be drinking pasteurized milk and fruit juices or avoiding eating raw and undercooked foods. Practice good personal hygiene by hand washing regularly, avoiding food preparation when sick, and cleaning and sanitizing the kitchen or food preparation areas. Avoid cross-contamination. Cross-contamination happens when bacteria from raw foods come in contact with foods that are ready to eat and do not need any further cooking. Cleaning and sanitizing food contact surfaces like knives and cutting boards can help reduce the chances of cross-contamination. Cook food adequately. This is important for general food safety. Review the safe cooking temperature chart on page 2-21. The cooking process is how we kill some of the harmful bacteria. In food preservation, it is important that the foods that we are preserving reach a proper internal temperature. We will talk more about that throughout this course. Keep foods at safe temperatures. This practice speaks directly to the temperature and time parts of Fat Tom. Keeping foods at safe temperatures include temperature control, serving temperatures, cooling, and thawing foods properly. Foodborne illnesses are the result of consuming plant or animal products that are contaminated with pathogens or toxins. There are millions of foodborne illnesses reported each year. It is our goal to minimize risk to consumers by following safe food handling practices. Canning is the process of heating food in a jar to attain shelf stability. For food to be shelf stable, home canned foods must receive sufficient heat processing to kill any microorganisms that can cause spoilage and illness. We will talk more about the factors that influence processing, time, and methods of canning in Chapter 3. There are two types of proper canning methods. They include the boiling water process, which is shown in the left photo. This is often a large kettle with a rack that sits in the bottom. The second method is steam pressure process, or pressure canning. This is a large pot with a locking lid, gaskets, and a pressure measuring mechanism. We will talk more about these parts a little later. The types of canner you use is determined by the food that you are canning. The A in Fat Tom, or acidity, is what helps us determine which canning process we will use. Acidity can be naturally occurring, like in most fruits, and some foods that have low acid, which make it easier for bacteria to grow. So depending on the acidity of or pH of a food, we use different processing and a longer or shorter processing time. This chart is on page 3-3 in your manual. This chart demonstrates the foods, their approximate pH range, and their recommended processing time. Each recipe will have a recommended processing time and pressure. This chart is good for reference to help guide proper processing. In Chapter 2, there is discussion about Clostridium botulinum. These spores are very hard to destroy. The USDA states that the only safe method for processing low-acid foods is to use a pressure canner. By using the pressure canner, you are able to increase the temperature at which water boils, and foods are processed at 250 degrees Fahrenheit as opposed to 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Acidity is one of the key players in determining how foods are processed and for how long. There are additional factors that play a role in determining processing times. These include what type of food is being canned? What is the composition of the food? Is it thick or dense? Are there bones or starches? The initial temperature of the food. Are you packing a product using a hot pack method or a raw pack method? The way in which heat transfers through the food. Be sure to read more about this on page 3-5. Altitude also plays a role in the temperature at which water boils. It is important to adjust for altitude when canning. And the number of spoilage organisms, or how fresh a product is. If the food has begun to decompose or decay, the processing time may not kill all of the spoilage organisms. Canning and food preservation information is plentiful. The best canning recipes have been scientifically developed and tested for safety. There are a handful of resources that are recommended, including the USDA's Complete Guide to Canning and various cooperative extension programs. The most popular cooperative extension resources include Oregon State University Extension Pacific Northwest Publication Series, which is a partnership between Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. Montana State University Extension also continues to publish monk guides with information on preservation specific to Montana conditions. It is critical not to rely on old cookbooks, gardening publications, YouTube videos, and out-of-date home canning publications. There are two general categories of canners, the boiling water bath canner and the pressure canner. The boiling water canner is a large pot made of aluminum, porcelain-covered steel, or stainless steel. In this process, heat is transferred from the boiling water through the contents of the jar. A pressure canner may be used as a boiling water canner if it is deep enough to allow 1 to 2 inches of water above the tops of the jars. It is used with the lid on, just not pressurized. Pressure canners are large kettles with a cover that can be locked down to make it steam tight. Pressure canners have been extensively redesigned in recent years. Models from before the 1970s were heavy-walled, and most canners are now lightweight. These canners include a steam vent, a vent lock, safety fuse, jar rack, and either a pressure gauge or a weighted gauge. It is important that you read the manufacturer's directions to know how a particular weighted gauge should move to indicate the proper pressure. Each canner and each gauge are a little different. For pressure canners with a dial gauge, it is important that the gauges are tested yearly for accuracy before use and should be replaced if reading more than 2 pounds different than the testing unit. You can get your pressure gauge tested at your local extension office and in some communities at the local hardware store. When determining which pressure canner is best, a dial or a gauge, it is truly up to the user. There are benefits to both, and both types of pressure canners will produce a safe and quality product as long as all other requirements and recommendations are followed. There are many different types of jars and lids on the market. It is recommended to use a mason-type jar with a self-sealing lid. Canning jars come in a variety of sizes ranging from 1/4 pint to 1/2 gallon sizes. There are standard jar openings and wide mouth openings, which make it easier to fill. It is important that used jars which contain commercially processed foods, such as pasta sauce or pickles, are not recommended for home canning because the glass that is manufactured to be a one-time use. Canning lids are a 2-piece set, which includes a self-sealing flat lid and a metal ring. On page 3-15, there is more information about the shelf life of lids and how the sealing compound works and the importance of not reusing lids. Additional equipment for home food preservation might include items like a magnetic lid lifter, a bubble fryer, a jar lifter, a funnel, a food scale, and a thermometer. You might also use things like a cherry pitter, a food mill, or a bean slicer to help assist in the preparation of specific products. While processing a product can seem relatively simple, there are many steps that go into properly preparing and processing a product. This includes preparing the jars, filling the jars, measuring for headspace, closing the jar, processing and adjusting for altitude either by time or pressure, cooling, testing for a seal, and storage. These are essential steps to a successful and safely canned product. Chapter 3 discusses each of these steps in detail along with a table for comparison between a hot pack and a raw pack, as well as an image for headspace measurements. To prepare the jars, it is important to check for any cracks, chips, or nicks, especially on the sealing surface. Clean jars before each use and preheating jars can help prevent breakage. At the end of Chapter 3, Table 3.8 demonstrates ways and reasons a jar may have broken. To pack the jars, there are 2 methods, a raw pack or a hot pack. Recipes will designate which method to use. And before closing the jar, you must measure the headspace. The headspace is the space between the jar and the top of the food or canning liquid. Pressure canned foods require a larger headspace. When things go wrong, It is important that you do not reprocess a jar if 24 hours have passed since the original processing. If 24 hours have passed, there's an option to refrigerate or freeze. It's important that you understand how to properly evaluate canned food for spoilage, as well as properly dispose of it if there is spoilage. There's more information on this in Chapter 3. There are a variety of canning methods that are not recommended because they do not meet certain safety standards for processing foods at home. Open kettle canning and oven canning. There are a variety of canning methods that are not recommended because they are not safe and do not meet certain standards for processing foods at home. Open kettle canning, oven canning, and others that people might suggest to you. You will learn more about these processes and why they are not recommended to preserve food at home. Steam canning remains an issue of concern. It is important to use and follow guidelines for an atmospheric steam canner for home food preservation. As long as certain criteria are met, steam canning is considered safe. The criteria are on page 3-27. A steam canner is considered safe to use as long as the process and recipe meet certain criteria. The food must be high in acid. The recipe must be research tested and developed specifically for steam canning. A pure steam environment at 212 degrees must be maintained, and the jars must be heated prior to filling. There is additional information on expectations and requirements to safely use a steam canner on page 3-27. Emergency preparedness. In this chapter, there are extensive details on what to do with foods that have been through extreme heat like a fire, loss of power, chemical exposure, and floods. Without going into depth, in this chapter you will learn about storage of water, including how much water is recommended for each person in your household and how to store the water. Food storage has several guidelines. Some good foods to keep on hand for emergencies include canned meat, fruits and vegetables, juices, dried soups, milk, peanut butter, jelly, crackers, and other dried goods. It is important to remember to keep your food storage away from anywhere that pests might get into. This chapter is small but mighty. Be sure you are prepared for any emergency when it comes to food and water. We have learned all sorts of information about food preservation and food safety in this section. We talked about the basics of food safety, foodborne illness, principles of canning, including the methods and the importance of which method of canning to use for specific foods. We finished off with emergency preparedness. Please make sure to note any questions that you have, as we will have time to discuss them throughout the class. These are your guiding chapters and will offer you the basic knowledge that you will need as we move through the remainder of this course.